He didn't say a word, but the laugh cut deeper than any insult. A pilot's smirk at 30,000 feet was just the beginning. What started as a quiet flight turned into a nationwide reckoning. One man's calm exposed a system built on silence. Now the sky's watching and the mic was never off. Some flights changed destinations. This one changed the rules. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The plane had that hum, the kind that makes your thoughts louder than they should be. It was a mid-morning flight out of Atlanta, headed for Denver, sky clear, engine steady. Passengers shuffled in, some eager, some tired, most indifferent, but not all of them. Shaquille O'Neal walked in, with a quiet presence, no entourage, no show, just him, hoodie, sweats, headphones around his neck, but not over his ears. He nodded at the flight attendant with a kind smile and tucked himself into 1A, first class, front row. No announcement, no swagger. He just wanted a window, a little legroom, and maybe a nap. People recognized him. Sure, a few camera clicks behind cupped hands. One kid's whisper, "That's Big Shaq, Mom." But he didn't flinch. He was used to being seen, and even more used to being misjudged. But what he wasn't expecting was the laugh. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even meant for everyone. But it was sharp. A clipped, smug sound. More air than voice, but packed with meaning. It came from the cockpit door, where the pilot stood for a moment longer than he needed to. He wasn't making a joke. He was making a point. Shaq turned his head slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of the man's face. Clean-cut, sun-worn, 50-something, with the same jawline and stare you see in military portraits. The captain's name tag read W. Drake. Their eyes met for a second. Then Drake smirked, gave a little shake of his head, and walked back into the cockpit. That laugh wasn't about amusement. It was about challenge, about disbelief, about the silent question, "What are you doing up here?" Shaq didn't move. He leaned back in his seat, eyes on the tray table now, jaw tight. It wasn't the first time someone looked at him like he didn't belong. But today that look came from a man with wings on his chest, one who controlled altitude, announcements, and the peace of the next 4 hours. The plane taxied. The usual safety briefing. Shaq barely heard it. That laugh stuck to his skin like cold sweat. The woman seated in 1B, a silver-haired older lady with soft eyes and a leather-bound journal, glanced at him briefly, sensing something. She didn't say a word. She just reached into her bag and pulled out a peppermint, gently set it on his tray. He looked at it, then at her. She smiled kindly, as if to say, "I saw it too." Shaq nodded, pocketed the candy and closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come. 30 minutes into the flight, a flight attendant approached with a tray. "Mr. O'Neal, would you like your meal early?" Shaq blinked. "I'm good. Thanks." He paused. "Actually, can I ask you something?" "Of course," she said, voice light but a little nervous. "That pilot, Captain Drake, he been flying this route long?" She looked surprised. "Yes. You know him." Shaq shook his head slowly. "Nah. Just curious." She nodded politely, then walked off. But her smile had faltered. Just for a second, the seatbelt light pinged on. The plane hit a mild turbulence pocket. Nothing serious, but enough to make a few passengers grip armrests. The older woman beside him gasped and clutched her necklace. Shaq opened his eyes and gently placed a steadying hand on her arm. Not too firm, just enough. "We're all right," he said calmly. "Just the sky reminding us we're up here." She let out a small breath, comforted. The intercom crackled. Drake's voice came through, too casual, too clipped. "Folks, looks like a little patch of rough air ahead. We'll be riding it out for a few. Shouldn't be too bad, unless you're afraid of heights." A chuckle from a few passengers. But Shaq didn't smile. There was something off in Drake's tone. A jab wrapped in instructions. He wasn't just flying the plane. He was trying to steer the atmosphere. Shaq adjusted his seatbelt, eyes on the overhead compartment. The peppermint in his pocket pressed into his thigh. He started replaying the moment again. The laugh, the look, the shake of the head. There was no mistaking it. It wasn't about fame. It wasn't even about basketball. It was about something deeper. That kind of dismissal doesn't come from competition. It comes from discomfort. A man like Drake didn't laugh because Shaq was in first class. He laughed because he didn't believe Shaq should be. Another bump. More gasps. Shaq's large hand gripped the armrest. But his face stayed composed. He'd learned long ago not to let people see him rattled on, or off the court. But in that moment he wasn't thinking about flight paths or turbulence. He was thinking about the way some people use power. How they wrap it in politeness, bury it under protocol, or lace it into a laugh. He'd met plenty of Drakes before, on red carpets, in boardrooms, even at charity events. People who smiled with their mouths but spoke with their eyes, and what they said was always the same: don't get too comfortable. First class wasn't just about luxury. Not for Shaq. It was about space. Space to stretch, to breathe, to be. And yet, even there, the air could get tight if the wrong eyes were watching. Another ding. The seatbelt light went off. The older woman beside him whispered, "You're very kind." He turned to her. "Ma'am? You didn't have to calm me earlier," she said softly. "But you did. And I've flown with a lot of men in uniform who never even looked my way when I was scared." Shaq didn't know what to say. He just smiled, warm and small. The plane leveled out. The clouds thinned. Sunlight filtered through the window, glowing over his lap. He reached into his hoodie and pulled out a folded photo. A picture of his daughter, Raina, holding a backpack bigger than her, smiling from ear to ear. He stared at it. That laugh, it wasn't about him. Not really. It was about the world Raina would inherit, and that thought hit him harder than any turbulence. Up in the cockpit, Captain Drake adjusted his headset and glanced at the manifest again. He muttered something under his breath, then switched frequencies. Back in 1A, Shaq didn't need revenge. He didn't want drama. He wanted something far more dangerous to people like Drake: to exist in peace. That was the quiet rebellion. That was the power move. He tucked the photo away, sat back, and looked out the window. Let them laugh. Because some laughs fade before they reach the ear. But some silences, they echo. The noise inside the free dental clinic was more than just drills and waiting room chatter. It was full of life. Kids laughing nervously, single parents trying to calm them, volunteers in scrubs rushing between rooms, and every now and then, a shout of "next" from the back hallway. It was organized chaos, the kind that smelled like fluoride, warm hope, and something deeply human. And in the center of it all, ducking beneath a doorway too small for him, stood Shaquille O'Neal. He wasn't wearing anything flashy. Just a black hoodie, with a cracked school logo on the sleeve, and sneakers that had seen more sidewalk than spotlight. He leaned against the counter with a clipboard in hand, checking off names as if he were one of the staff, because for that day he was not as the face of a campaign or a celebrity drop-in. He was the reason this clinic had opened in the first place. But he didn't need that announced. He just needed to be there. A little boy no older than 7 stared at him, jaw half open, legs swinging nervously from the exam chair. Shaq noticed. He walked over slowly, crouched down till they were eye level. "You scared?" he asked. The boy nodded. "You know what I do when I'm scared?" Shaq whispered. The kid shook his head. "I pretend I'm made of bricks. Not the soft kind. The kind that hold up castles." The boy blinked, trying to process it, then smiled. Just barely. Shaq held up a fist for a bump. "You're stronger than you know, little man." The boy tapped it, and Shaq rose again, leaving behind one more piece of courage. In the hallway, a volunteer nurse named Terry watched him move, her expression one of quiet disbelief. "He doesn't just fund this?" she asked the coordinator. "No," the coordinator replied. "He restocks supply shelves. He signs invoices. Hell, last week he mopped the floor." Shaq kept moving. He didn't slow down until he reached the break room, where a woman with grace carved into every line of her face sat waiting with a paper bag in her lap. "Lucille O'Neal." "Meh," Shaq said, smiling. "Thought you weren't coming today." Lucille shook the bag. "You've been running around without eating. That's not how giants stay standing." He sat beside her, pulling out the turkey sandwich and apple slices with a childlike grin. "You still cut them up like I'm 10. You still eat like you're 12, she shot back. They sat in silence for a few moments, the kind only family can share. Then she placed a hand on his knee and said, "You know, son, I watch you in these places, and sometimes I wonder if folks see you at all." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "You mean like recognize me?" "No. I mean see you. See your heart. See past the height and the headlines. Some people walk into a room and shine. Others walk in and remind people of everything they're not. Every time you walk into a room, son, they either see your light or their own shadow. Shaq took that in. He didn't always know how to respond when his mother got like this, when her words had more weight than anything he could bench. Nah, he said finally. I'm just trying to do right. Lucille smiled. Proud. And that's exactly why you will. That afternoon they left the clinic together and drove across town to Beaumont High, an underfunded public school where paint peeled from lockers and hallways echoed more silence than joy. But today was different. Today, every senior boy would leave with a custom-fitted suit, paid for by someone they'd grown up idolizing on TV. But were now meeting eye to eye. Shaq stood in the makeshift dressing area once the gym, measuring sleeve lengths, adjusting lapels and telling jokes that made even the stiffest kids loosen up. They called him Big Unt. He wore the title like a badge. One of the students, lanky and unsure, stared at himself in the mirror, overwhelmed. This is too nice, the boy mumbled. I can't take this. Shaq stepped beside him, both their reflections filling the glass. You walk in with your head up, he told him. This suit? It doesn't change who you are. It shows people you already mattered. The boy nodded slowly. I got a job interview next week. First one. Shaq placed a hand on his shoulder. Then you wear that suit like you already got the job. By the time the event wound down, the room had transformed. Not just in appearance, but in spirit. There were handshakes, laughter, even tears from one grandmother, who had come to watch. And in the corner of the gym, leaning against the bleachers with a phone in her hand, stood Raina, Shaq's daughter. She had been watching the whole thing unfold, quietly, curiously. When they finally left, the sun was beginning to dip. Father and daughter walked toward the car, steps unhurried. You ever get tired of it? She asked. He looked down at her. Tired of what? Being the guy everyone expects something from. He considered the question. Not tired, he said after a beat. Just careful. You give too much of yourself, you run out. But if you give the right pieces, the parts that grow back, it's worth it. Raina looked out at the sky, thinking.
You're always calm, she said, even when people aren't kind.
Shaq chuckled. You think I'm calm? She nodded. Always. Like nothing shakes you. He sighed. You know, that's not true. I get shook. A lot. Then how do you stay gentle when the world's so hard? Shaq stopped walking, turned to face her. Because I don't want to become what tried to break me. There was silence after that. Not empty but full of understanding. Full of the kind of clarity that doesn't need follow-up. Raina nodded slowly, eyes reflecting something older than her years. They got in the car. The radio played something soft. Neither of them talked much on the way home. They didn't need to. The weight of the day, the laughter, the suits, the whispers, the questions, settled into the silence between them. Later that night, Shaq sat on the porch of his home, watching the moonlight stretch across his yard. He sipped warm tea, thought about the faces he saw that day, and wondered what kind of world they were stepping into. He reached into his hoodie pocket, pulled out a folded sheet of paper, a letter. He hadn't opened it yet. The envelope was stamped from Colorado. A man named Cliff Rowan, a journalist, had sent it weeks ago with a note. We need to talk about something that's happening in the skies. Shaq hadn't decided what to do about it. Not yet. He looked out at the stars and whispered to himself, some things you stand tall for, some things you bend down for. Either way, you show up. And in the distance, a plane moved across the night sky, silent, high and full of strangers. Somewhere on that plane, someone might be laughing. But the ones who lift others, they don't need noise. They just move. The hum of the engines returned like a memory being replayed. The flight resumed the next day, after a short delay. A minor maintenance issue, they'd said. Nothing critical. But when the passengers boarded Flight 208 again, the air inside felt tighter, more compressed, not just because of the pressurization, but because of something unspoken floating in the cabin. It was as if everyone could sense the unfinished tension from the day before. Shaq was one of the last to board, tall frame cutting a slow path through the aisle. He nodded to a flight attendant who offered a warm but nervous smile, and took his seat once again in one. First class was nearly full now. Business travelers, a tech guy in headphones, a woman flipping through a legal brief, a younger man in a designer suit, tried not to stare as Shaq folded himself back into the space like he didn't own more comfortable ones. From the cockpit, Captain Warren Drake stood for a moment, in the doorway again. the same way he had the previous day. No laugh this time, just a blank stare. But something in his eyes still smirked. The same energy condescending, like he was seeing not a man but a disruption. A headline, a symbol of something he didn't want in his airspace. He stepped back in and closed the door without a word. A few moments later, the voice crackled overhead. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain, Warren Drake, welcoming you aboard. Today's flight time is just under 3 hours. Please ensure your seats are upright and tray tables secured. Even if you think you don't need the reminder, we'll try to get you there comfortably, assuming everyone follows directions." It wasn't the words, it was the tone. Too clipped, too dry, like each instruction was a veiled jab. The flight attendants moved with practiced ease, but even they seemed tense. One of them glanced at Shaq as she passed, as if to apologize for something she couldn't quite name. As the plane rolled onto the runway, rain began streaking the windows. A storm front was pushing in from the west. Lightning far in the distance blinked like a warning, but air traffic control had cleared them. The cabin lights dimmed. The engines roared. Takeoff. The sky was charcoal gray, the kind that swallowed light. 15 minutes into the climb, the turbulence started. Nothing dangerous, but enough to make overhead bins rattle and glasses clink. In row 2, a young man fumbled with his backpack as it slid from beneath his seat. He was struggling to hold it still, cursing under his breath, trying not to spill his drink. Without a word, Shaq leaned down, one hand reaching across to steady the man's cup, while the other pulled the bag up gently and secured it. "Thanks," the guy muttered, still a little flustered. "No problem," Shaq said with a soft nod, like it was just another normal moment. And for him it was. Another few bumps rocked the plane. Gasps floated from a few rows back. The older woman in 1B, new today, but visibly nervous, gripped her armrest until her knuckles turned white. Her face was pale, lips thin with tension. Shaq turned slowly, reaching into his carry-on. He pulled out a dark gray hoodie, oversized, warm, and gently placed it over her shoulders. "Helps with the chill," he said. She looked at him, startled by the kindness, then smiled with teary eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'm sorry. I hate flying. I've been taller than most ceilings my whole life," Shaq said lightly. "So trust me, I get what it feels like to not be in control." She laughed, weakly but genuinely. Her grip loosened. In the cockpit, Drake adjusted the autopilot and glanced down at the in-flight camera monitor. He could see part of the first-class cabin. He could see the interaction. "Always gotta play the saint," he muttered under his breath. His co-pilot, a younger man named Blake, glanced sideways. "Excuse me?" Drake didn't look up. "Nothing. Just, some people are real good at knowing where the cameras are." Blake didn't respond, but he didn't agree either. The seatbelt light remained on longer than usual. More turbulence. Not unsafe, but consistent. Passengers shifted in their seats, murmuring. One flight attendant bumped into a tray while walking too fast. There was an air of restlessness in the cabin. Uncertainty in the way people exchanged glances. Shaq stayed centered, grounded as ever. A presence, not a performance. But not everyone liked it. Captain Drake returned to the intercom. "Apologies for the bumps, folks. We've asked the weather to cooperate, but she's being stubborn. Until then, maybe distract yourself, unless you think you're too important for turbulence." There it was again. Not quite a joke. Not quite innocent. The kind of thing someone says when they want to poke without leaving a mark. Shaq felt it, heard it, understood exactly who it was aimed at. He didn't react. He just reached into the seat pocket in front of him and pulled out the airline's emergency safety card, pretending to read it. But his jaw clenched slightly, not out of anger, out of familiarity, because he knew what this was. The need to diminish. The slow drip of disrespect that never spills over, but stains everything underneath. 30 minutes later, a cart rolled through with snacks. The flight attendant offered drinks, snacks, small talk. When she reached Shaq, she paused.
"Mr. O'Neill, would you like anything?"
He looked up. "You got those chocolate chip cookies?" She smiled. "I saved you too. Figured you might ask." He laughed quietly. "You're my hero today." She handed him the cookies wrapped in a napkin, then leaned in slightly, voice low. "For what it's worth, a lot of people see what's happening. They just don't say anything." Shaq nodded, appreciating the courage even in that quiet admission. Back in the cockpit, Blake stared at the radar. "Looks like we're going to hit another patch near Kansas airspace," he said. Drake grunted. "Perfect. Maybe we'll shake some sense into a few egos. Blake stared at him for a long second. You got a problem with our passenger? Drake didn't answer directly. Just said, some people walk into rooms, expecting the whole place to shift. But not every space is theirs. Some of us earned our stripes. Sounds personal, Blake replied. Drake turned his head slowly. You young guys think everything's about inclusion. Sometimes it's just about keeping order. Blake looked forward again. Said nothing. But a small red light blinked silently on the dash. A cockpit voice recorder. Always running. Meanwhile, Shaq was deep in thought, staring out the window as the clouds broke briefly. A ray of sunlight shot across the wing. For a second it felt peaceful again. Until the overhead lights flickered once, twice, the seatbelt light blinked on again. This is your captain. Weather's gonna get playful for a bit. Stay seated and hold tight, Drake said with a casualness that didn't match the tension in his voice. The plane dipped slightly. Someone screamed in the back. Just a reflex. Shaq stayed calm. He turned to the woman beside him again. You okay? She nodded. I think so. You're doing better than the plane. That made her laugh again. But up front, in the cockpit, something was boiling beneath Drake's professionalism. It wasn't about turbulence. It wasn't about Shaq being famous. It was something else. Something older. Deeper. Something about control, and the way it felt to lose even a little bit of it to someone who never had to ask for the spotlight, but still drew it in. Shaq didn't want the spotlight. He just wanted airspace. Space to exist without commentary, without laughter, without layers of assumption. But some men don't like sharing the sky. And some, like Warren Drake, would rather stir the clouds than admit the storm is coming from within. The plane touched down harder than expected. Wheels screaming across the tarmac like they'd been waiting to complain. A low groan ran through the fuselage, followed by silence, then cautious clapping from a few passengers who didn't know whether to be grateful or concerned. The captain's voice came over the intercom, distant and overly casual. Welcome to Montgomery Regional. Not where we plan to land. But sometimes the sky plays its own game. There was no explanation beyond technical delay. No timeline. Just apologetic smiles from the flight crew, and a sudden rush of humidity as the plane doors opened to a sleepy southern afternoon. Shaq stood slowly, his knees stiff from the hours of tension and altitude. As he ducked through the low frame and stepped off the jet bridge, the air hit him thick, hot with June heat, and the faint scent of pine and gasoline. The airport was small, almost quiet enough to hear the luggage wheels dragging across tile. Inside the terminal, airline representatives tried to remain cheerful as they handed out hotel vouchers and meal credits. One desk agent looked overwhelmed, her fingers shaking slightly as she tapped through passenger lists. Another spilled coffee near the printers, muttering apologies that no one had asked for. People just wanted answers, but none came. Shaq waited at the end of the line, patient, nodding to a few fans who recognized him. He didn't take out his phone, didn't scroll or distract, just stood there, 6'11" in a hoodie and track pants, calmly absorbing the situation. Eventually a shuttle took the first batch of passengers toward the assigned hotel. The Radford, a worn-out 3-story relic tucked off a side road, flanked by dying magnolia trees, and a parking lot with more cracks than pavement. The sign buzzed faintly, a few bulbs flickering like they were too tired to fight the dusk. Inside the lobby, old ceiling fans pushed warm air around, faded wallpaper peeled near the corners, and the tile near the welcome desk had a long crack running down the middle like a scar. Behind the counter stood a young woman with a sharp jawline, tight braid, and eyes that had seen more than her age suggested. Harley Quinnell, night manager and part-time EMT trainee, looked up from her screen as the guests began to filter in. She scanned the group without much interest, until her gaze landed on Shaq. Her breath caught, but not in the way it did for most people. It wasn't fame that stopped her. It was recognition of a different kind. Slower, deeper, almost reluctant. She'd seen that face before, but not from courtside seats or magazine covers. No, she'd seen that face in a memory she didn't talk about. One tied to a hospital, a check she never expected, and a brother who'd almost disappeared. Behind Shaq, another figure entered. The pilot, Captain Warren Drake. His tie was loosened, collar slightly damp with sweat, but he still walked like he owned the floor beneath him. When he saw Shaq in the same lobby, waiting for the same front desk clerk, he tilted his head with an amused smirk. Didn't expect to see royalty slumming it here, Drake said, his voice just loud enough to catch the ears of nearby guests. Shaq turned, slow and measured. His face didn't shift, just his eyes. Didn't expect a man with wings to look so small. A few guests froze. The tension wasn't explosive. It was cold, like air conditioning that suddenly ran too hard. Drake blinked but didn't reply. He walked past, keys already in hand, shoulders stiff with a kind of wounded pride. Harley said nothing for a moment, just watched the interaction. Then she glanced at Shaq, eyes narrowing with something like conflicted memory. "I've got a corner room," she said. "View's not much, but it's quiet." Shaq nodded. "That works." She slid him a keycard. As he turned to leave, she added, "You don't remember me, do you?" He paused, looked back, really looked this time. Her face was familiar, but he couldn't place it.
I was 19, she said. My brother was in bad shape. Rehab bills stacking up. No insurance. A check came in. No name attached. I tracked it. Led back to a foundation with your initials.
Shaq's brow furrowed slightly. Humbled. He make it through? She nodded. 3 years clean. Teaches carpentry now. Shaq offered a quiet smile. That's him. I just helped. Harley leaned in a little, voice dropping. That guy Drake. Be careful. Shaq's eyes narrowed slightly. Not out of fear, but curiosity. You know him? Knew him, she said. Not proud of that. What's he still doing flying? That's a good question, she replied. One not enough people ask. Shaq studied her for a second, reading more than she said. Appreciate the heads up. He headed to his room. The elevator groaned as it ascended. Carpeting in the hallway was threadbare, the number plates crooked. But the quiet was real. He slid into the room, tossed his duffel onto the chair, and sat at the edge of the bed. It didn't creak under his weight, surprisingly sturdy. The air smelled faintly of bleach and old leather. He pulled out his phone, checked messages. Raina had texted, heard about the landing. You good? He replied with a thumbs up and a heart. Another message from a number he hadn't saved. Just one sentence. We need to talk. You're being watched more than you think. Shaq stared at it for a moment, then locked the screen. Across the hall, Drake stood in his room, pacing. He looked out the window at the empty parking lot and scowled. His pride felt bruised, but more than that, he felt exposed. He was used to quiet control, to being the unseen authority that passengers didn't question. Shaq, just by being who he was, had shifted that balance, and worse, people noticed. Back downstairs, Harley made a quiet call from the office phone. Hey, she whispered. You're not gonna believe who just walked through here. Yeah, him. And Drake's here too. The person on the other end said something that made her eyes widen. No, she said. You're kidding. Then quieter, more serious. I thought that file was buried. She hung up, heart racing just a bit. Stepped out of the office and back into the lobby, where the silence was now dense with secrets waiting to break. In room 306, Shaq sat in the dark, phone face down, eyes on the ceiling. Somewhere in the walls, a pipe hissed. He let the sound settle over him, then reached into his backpack and pulled out a worn fold. Inside were clippings, letters, newsprint, notes he'd kept about systemic bias in public spaces, aviation included. He'd been watching for years. Now it felt like maybe, just maybe, the sky was beginning to tilt. He took a deep breath, closed folder, and looked out the window toward the far horizon. Montgomery wasn't on the itinerary, but maybe this detour had its own reason. He heard the elevator doors open, followed by soft footsteps. He didn't look up until they stopped near him. Harley stood a few feet away, holding 2 paper cups of coffee. Her hair, now loosely tied back, was beginning to fray at the edges, and her eyes had that look, tired, alert, like someone replaying an old memory, and trying not to let it shake them too hard. Didn't think you'd still be up, she said, offering him one of the cups. Shaq took it with a nod. Didn't think I'd be thinking this much, either. They stood in silence for a few seconds, sipping slowly, the hallway buzzing low with building tension neither of them had quite named yet. Then Harley spoke, voice barely above a whisper. You don't remember me, but you saved my brother's life. Shaq turned toward her now, more fully, his brow furrowed. 6 years ago, she went on. His name's Jacob. He was 17. On a fast road to nowhere, my mom had passed. I was working doubles, barely hanging on. Then one day, out of nowhere, we get this letter, full ride to a rehab facility. Private, clean staffed, said it was funded by a scholarship in my brother's name. I looked into it, found out the check came from one of your community outreach funds. Quiet. No press. No picture. Shaq's shoulders relaxed slightly, but he didn't smile. He just listened, deeply, respectfully. I tried to write a thank you letter, she added. It came back. No return address. Guess you didn't want the praise. Shaq spoke then, quiet but grounded. Praise doesn't fix pain, just gets in the way sometimes. Harley looked down at her coffee cup, fingers tightening around it. He's doing okay now, she said. Teaches carpentry at the county center. Got 2 kids. Lives clean. Still shakes when he talks about that year though. It nearly ate him. Shaq nodded slowly. That's his story to own now. I'm just glad he's still here. She met his eyes then. Me too. The storm cracked louder outside, a bolt lighting up the hallway through the small window near the elevator. The hum of the hotel's HVAC system kicked on in the background, filling the silence between them for a long beat. Then Harley took a breath. Like she was shifting gears. Like the weight of one truth had only been the prelude to something heavier. I used to date Warren Drake. Shaq's face didn't shift much, but his eyes did. Sharpened. Just a little. She saw it. Yeah, I know. How long? Shaq asked, not as accusation, but curiosity laced with caution. About 1.5 years. We met through a veterans fundraiser. I thought he was charming, confident, respected. You know how it is. Some men learn how to wear good on the outside, but it fades, real quick. Shaq said nothing, waiting. It started with jokes. Casual stuff. Things he thought were funny. Don't be so sensitive, he'd say. But it wasn't just jokes. It was how he talked about people. People who didn't look like him. People who challenged him. Black passengers. Latina flight attendants. Women who dared question something. He had this phrase he'd use. People forget who the cockpit belongs to. He said it once like a joke. The second time I realized it wasn't. Shaq's jaw tightened slightly. You ever report him? I did. Quietly. Filed a concern with HR. Thought it'd be anonymous. She laughed bitterly. 3 weeks later, I was let go from the charter company I worked dispatch for. No explanation. Just cut. And he got promoted. Shaq looked away for a second. Processing. He's erased things, Shaq, Harley said, voice rising slightly. Logs. Incidents. I've seen him scrub cockpit records, saw him talk a junior pilot out of reporting a breach. He's got friends in the right places, and no one wants to question a decorated vet who flies clean routes and plays golf with supervisors. So why tell me this now? Harley took a step closer. Because I saw what happened in that lobby. That wasn't just a snide remark. That was a man used to unchallenged space. And you just by sitting there, you cracked that. Shaq stayed quiet, but something in his posture shifted. Not readiness. Not aggression. Just purpose. I don't know what you're planning, Harley continued. But I want in. I've got access to a few systems still. People who owe me favors. There's a paper trail. Pieces. Enough to start threading something together. Shaq took a breath. Deep. Measured. This isn't revenge, he said. I know. This is about light. I know that too. The hallway felt smaller now, like it was holding in more air than it should. The moment had stretched, drawn out between 2 people who shared nothing on paper but had stumbled into the same truth. Shaq finished the last sip of his coffee and handed her the empty cup. You ever think about why people like him do what they do? He asked. Harley tilted her head. Control? Shaq nodded. Control. Territory. Fear in a tuxedo. Men like him. They laugh. But not because they're amused. They laugh because it keeps them from having to listen. Harley blinked. The hallway lights flickered briefly, catching on her expression. You planning on making him listen? Shaq didn't smile. Didn't nod. Just said, I'm planning on making him look in the mirror. For once. They stood there for a moment longer. Then Harley handed him a small slip of paper. This is my personal number. Use it when you're ready. Shaq took it without a word. As she turned to walk back down the hallway, her footsteps soft but certain, he spoke one last time. Harley. She paused. You're braver than you think. She looked back at him. Eyes tired but clear. So are you. Then she was gone. The hallway stretching long again. The silence filling in behind her like waves closing after a boat passes. Shaq stepped back into his room, set the paper down beside his phone, and looked out the window at the storm rolling over the city. The rain was heavier now, coating the streets below in thin rivers of silver. In the distance, a lone car crept along the road, its headlights cutting through the mist like searchlights. He sat on the edge of the bed, opened his folder again. This time, he added a note in the margin. Drake. Unconfirmed cover-ups. Racial misconduct. FAA logs. Then underlined it once. His reflection stared back at him in the window. Not the athlete. Not the icon. Just a man carrying stories that weren't his, and choosing not to look away from them. Because sometimes, what you don't remember is the very thing someone else can never forget. And when the truth finally comes into view, the ones who've lived in silence the longest tend to speak the loudest. The system she was in wasn't supposed to still be active. An archived cloud database linked to an old FAA contractor portal. Years ago, the Radford had briefly served as overflow housing for federal aviation crews during airport upgrades. Most of those records had been scrubbed clean when the contract ended. Most. Harley wasn't sure what she was looking for, but she trusted her instinct, and it hadn't failed her yet. She typed in a name, Warren Drake, then narrowed the search window. Personnel incident logs. The screen froze for a second, spinning. Then something blinked into view. FA internal use only. Confidential entry. Level 2 complaint. Review closed, case settled. Redacted. Her stomach dropped. It wasn't just real. It was buried under levels of bureaucracy designed to make it disappear. She clicked the link. A black and white report loaded on the screen. The file was partially redacted. Names blacked out. Some details blurred. But the core of it hit hard. Flight 741 Denver to Chicago. October. Complainant. Internal staff. Role, flight attendant. Gender, female. Ethnicity, Hispanic. Self-identified. The body of the report was damning, even with redactions. Captain Drake made several racially inappropriate comments directed toward the complainant, including references to language ability and cultural fit with cabin crew standards. When confronted, Drake dismissed the concerns, referring to it as locker room banter, and accused the attendant of being too emotional to handle high-stress environments. The complainant requested reassignment, and later filed a formal complaint after her schedule was reduced for the following quarter. She alleges retaliation, case reviewed by HR, and FAA Internal Affairs. Outcome: settlement reached out of court. No disciplinary record entered into official file. Harley stared at the screen, stunned. She scrolled to the final note. Do not re-index. Archive securely. Per FAA legal. She knew what that meant. They buried it, paid for silence, and kept his record clean on paper, so no one else would question the man in the pilot's seat. Her hand moved to printer icon. She clicked it. The machine behind the desk came to life with a mechanical hum, spitting out pages. With each printed sheet, Harley felt her pulse rise. Her fingers trembled as she stacked the documents, flipping through them, reading each word twice. When the last page slid out, she snatched them up and walked quickly to the back office, locking the door behind her. She sat at the staff desk and laid the sheets out like puzzle pieces. Even redacted, the narrative was unmistakable. Drake hadn't just been caught once. He'd been managed, protected. And it wasn't about one kind of bias. It was about power, used carelessly, consistently, against women, against people of color, against anyone he didn't feel belonged in his version of the sky. And suddenly, all the small things, the laugh, the smirk, the subtle digs at Shaq, clicked together like teeth on a zipper. This wasn't a one-off moment of ego. It was part of a history. She reached for her phone, hands shaking. She snapped photos of every page, careful to avoid glare. Then she encrypted the images and saved them to her private drive. She didn't trust keeping only one version, not anymore. Her breath came uneven. She stood up, paced the small office. Every part of her told her this was the right thing to do. But every part also knew that the second Drake found out she had this, she'd become a target. He'd done it before. Quietly, efficiently. She'd lost a job over a whisper last time. What would he do now that someone had the receipts? She sat down again, stared at the papers, then whispered to herself, "He'll destroy this if he finds out I have it." There was a knock at the door, not loud, but firm. Her heart leapt. She checked the clock, 2:13 a.m. No one should have been down here. Another knock. She slid the papers into a folder, then into her backpack under the desk. She cracked the door open cautiously. It was Shaq. He stood there in a black t-shirt and sweatpants, holding a water bottle. Didn't mean to scare you, he said gently. Desk was empty. Figured you might still be back here. She let out a shaky breath. You've got good timing. He tilted his head. Something happened. Harley looked behind her, back at the desk, then pulled the door open wider.
Yeah?
You're gonna want to sit down. They moved to the lounge, dimly lit with one lamp, chairs that had long lost their cushion memory, and a coffee table scratched from years of bored fingernails. She laid the folder on the table between them, and opened it. Shaq leaned in slowly, scanning the first page. He didn't blink much. His face was carved from calm, but Harley could see the tension growing under the surface. When he got to the line about retaliation, he exhaled through his nose. This was never just about me, he murmured. No, Harley said. It never was. He kept flipping through, reading, absorbing, processing. She watched him read the final note, the part where the complaint was buried, silenced. He sat back, eyes still on the paper. He did this, Shaq said quietly, to someone he worked beside, someone depending on him to keep the plane safe. If you can treat a colleague like that, you've already decided who matters and who doesn't. Harley nodded, and the system let him fly on. They sat in silence for a moment, rain now easing outside the hotel, as if the sky itself was listening. Shaq picked up one of the printed pages, holding it like it might turn to dust if he wasn't careful. She risked everything to speak up, he said, and still lost. Harley leaned forward. But you're not just anyone. He knows that. If this goes public, if this ties to someone like you, it won't get buried again. Shaq looked up at her, a new clarity behind his eyes. This needs to be more than a leak, he said. It needs to be a pattern, a story, a chain that connects him to other names, other moments, not just a single case. Harley nodded slowly. Then we start pulling the thread. I know someone, Shaq said. Journalist. Been chasing FAA bias cases for years. He sent me a letter a few weeks ago. I didn't read it until yesterday. Name's Cliff Rowland. I've heard that name, Harley said. He wrote the piece on the Denver Control Tower cover-up. Same guy. Shaq stood, folder in hand, then looked at her. You're sure you're ready for this? I've been ready, she said. I just never had someone to stand next to. Shaq nodded once, then extended a fist. She smiled and tapped hers to his. He walked out into the hallway, papers tucked under his arm, shadows stretching in the quiet glow of dawn creeping into the windows. Back at the desk, Harley sat alone for a moment, breathing deep. Then she pulled out her laptop again, opened a new file, and began to list names. Because now the clock had started ticking, and the sky, quiet as it looked, was about to become a battleground for truth. The air in Montgomery still held a heavy kind of stillness the next morning, like the storm hadn't fully left, just stepped aside for a while. Shaq stood outside a small elementary school, not far from the Radford, arms folded, watching the kids pour in through the gates. Their laughter rang out in bursts, rising above the low hum of cars and chirping cicadas. The school looked like it had seen better funding but not better days. Paint fading, fences crooked, a basketball hoop with no net, but it pulsed with life. A teacher, wide-eyed and whispering thank yous under her breath, had asked if Shaq would stop by. Word had traveled fast that he was in town, not as a celebrity drop-in, but as something more intentional. He hadn't planned this visit, but his heart, as always, made room. Inside the gym, kids sat cross-legged on the worn hardwood floor. Teachers lined the back wall, and Shaq stood at center court, speaking without notes. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't give a rehearsed speech. He talked about strength, not the kind in muscles or highlights, but the kind you need to stay soft in a hard world. He talked about fear, about being underestimated, about not letting someone else's limits shrink your vision. People might see you and try to write your story before you even hold the pen, he said, but you get to choose what goes on the page. A few teachers wiped away tears. A kid in the front row whispered to his friend, "He's like a real-life giant who reads poetry." Afterward, as kids flooded him for handshakes, photos, and the occasional too-tight hug, a woman lingered near the gym door. She wasn't a teacher. She wore no school ID, carried no clipboard. She looked like someone who belonged somewhere else entirely. Pressed slacks, polished boots, a white blouse tucked in too sharply for a Tuesday morning. Her hair was cropped short, silver streaks running through tight curls. Her eyes were calm, but studied everything. Shaq noticed her watching. She didn't flinch when he looked back. She nodded once, After the last kid filed out, the woman approached, footsteps slow but certain. "You're better at that than most politicians," she said. Shaq smiled. "I try not to talk at people. Makes listening easier." She extended her hand. "Geneva Wallace." He shook it. "Nice to meet you." "Not my first time seeing you," she said. "I flew you once. Denver to Miami. Long time ago." He tilted his head. "You were flight crew?" "I was the pilot." That made Shaq pause. Not because he doubted her, but because something about the way she said it didn't feel past tense by choice. She continued, 22 years flying. Commercial, domestic, cargo. Then one report, one misstep in protocol I didn't even make. And they shut me down.
What happened?
She hesitated. Warren Drake. Shaq's eyes narrowed, heartbeat slowing like a record dropping into a groove. "He was my supervisor at the time," she said. "I was in line for a promotion. Senior captain for Long Range International. 1 week before my review, an incident report gets filed. Says I violated altitude protocol on a descent. Problem is, I didn't. Radar logs proved it, but the version that got submitted to the FAA, the logs were inconclusive." "You're saying he faked the report?" "I'm saying he buried the evidence that cleared me." Shaq didn't speak, just listened. Let the silence say what words couldn't. Geneva pulled a small object from her coat pocket. A matte black USB drive. She held it out to him. "I didn't come here to unload my story," she said. "I came because I've got something bigger than that. This has cockpit audio from that day, plus some internal emails from a source I won't name. One of them is Drake forwarding an altered radar log to a FAA contact with the subject line. Let's clean this up." Shaq took the drive, turning it in his fingers like it might burn through his skin. "I didn't think I'd ever see you in Montgomery," she said. "But when I heard you were here and that you'd had an incident with Drake, it felt like time caught up." "Why didn't you go public?" he asked. "I tried. 3 years of hearings, appeals, letters. I was told there wasn't enough evidence, and that I had a reputation for conflict. That's how they label women like me, who speak up and don't smile while doing it." Shaq looked at the USB again. "This is your move now," Geneva said. Shaq sat down on the bleachers, eyes scanning the empty gym. He wasn't someone who acted on emotion. Not publicly, but inside there was a stirring now, louder than it had ever been. "I don't want revenge," he said finally. "Neither did I," Geneva replied. "I wanted my wings back. Not for pride, just because I earned them. This man's been flying on borrowed power for too long, and the system either helped or turned away." Shaq stood up. His voice was soft, but there was iron underneath it. "You were a woman with wings." And he clipped them. She looked at him, steady. "Yeah, but he's not the only one who flies now. We all rise when truth does." They stood in silence, shoulder to shoulder. Two people from different paths connected by the same storm. He put the USB into his coat pocket. It felt heavier than it should have. Geneva offered one last thought, before turning to leave. "You speak for people without ever raising your voice. That's your power. But sometimes, speaking with your voice is the only way they hear it." Shaq nodded. "It's time." As she walked out into the daylight, Shaq remained in the gym, the echoes of children's laughter gone now, replaced with a different kind of sound, resolve, rising quietly. He pulled out his phone and opened a draft message to Cliff Rowan. Subjected Drake FA, materials you need to see. Attachment, incoming. This doesn't end in silence. He hit send. Because some men are given wings and forget they can be taken back. And some people, like Geneva, never needed permission to fly. They just needed space to rise. It wasn't just that Shaq had helped a nervous passenger or stayed calm when others didn't. It wasn't just the storm. A video had surfaced, just a few seconds long, of him at the local school, kneeling beside a boy with a speech delay, helping him recite a poem. The teacher had filmed it quietly and posted it without fanfare, but the internet had no chill. By morning it had been shared across platforms with captions like, "He doesn't just show up. He stands up." People noticed him differently now. Not with stares of celebrity curiosity, but with something closer to reverence, recognition, even gratitude. Shaq stood in the priority boarding line, hoodie draped over one arm, backpack slung low. A flight attendant whispered to another, not even trying to hide her smile. A woman with a toddler gently nodded toward him, mouthing, "Thank you," like it was something she'd been holding onto since the last flight. He just nodded back, quiet as always. Captain Warren Drake entered from the gate door like a man trying to reclaim a stage. Uniform crisp, face unreadable, eyes scanning the passengers. He walked with the kind of posture that came from years of being obeyed. But that morning, something was different. People didn't move around him the same way. Their deference was slower. His gaze landed on Shaq. As he passed, he leaned in just enough for only one man to hear. "Enjoy the seat while you can." Shaq didn't flinch, didn't even blink, just said, under his breath, "Enjoy the view while it lasts." Drake walked on, his jaw tightening. He didn't respond. What Drake didn't see, what he hadn't yet registered, was that someone else was watching, not just the passengers or crew. A new figure stood just beyond the jet bridge, dressed in a standard pilot uniform but with a different badge clipped neatly to his belt. Darren Holt. His presence wasn't loud. He moved with quiet precision, eyes observant but not invasive. To most, he looked like another pilot doing a secondary check or rotating in, but the badge gave him away to those who knew. FAA Internal Affairs. Undercover, methodical, and he wasn't here for the weather. He watched Drake walk into the cockpit with barely a glance at the co-pilot seat. Shaq boarded without ceremony, settling again into 1A. A few passengers nodded at him as they passed. One slipped him a handwritten note, just a thank you. Another handed her boarding pass to the flight attendant with one line. "If there's a seat next to him, I'd like to sit there." It was declined politely, but the message was clear. This man had earned more than a headline. He'd earned space. Darren followed at the back of the boarding group. He paused briefly at Shaq's row, pretending to check his seat assignment. His eyes met Shaq's. Just for a second. It was enough. Shaq understood. The plane filled slowly. Overhead bins clicked shut. Cabin noise rose in murmurs. Drake's voice came over the intercom, smooth and detached. "Welcome back, folks. Should be a quiet flight this morning. Looks like clear skies ahead. We'll do our best to make up some time and get you where you're going." Not a hint of tension in his tone. Not a crack in the shell. But behind that voice, something was shifting. Control was slipping, and he didn't know it yet. As the plane taxied down the runway, the engine spooled, wind rising past the windows. The sky opened above them, a deep stretch of blue broken by soft clouds. But in the cockpit, two men sat silently, Drake at the controls, and beside him Darren Holt, watching everything. The flight climbed smoothly. Cabin lights dimmed to cruising mode. A flight attendant offered drinks and snacks. Shaq declined, earbuds in, eyes closed but not asleep. In the cockpit, Darren initiated conversation. "You've been on this route a while," he said casually. Drake didn't look at him. 10 years. Long time. Efficient. Simple. A fly clean. Darren nodded. "I read your file. Says the same." Drake glanced at him now, more direct. "UFAA?" Darren smiled faintly. "Would it matter if I was?" Drake's eyes narrowed for a second, then returned to the instruments. "Not unless someone's trying to make a mountain out of a clean record." "Clean records are interesting," Darren replied. "They usually mean one of two things, either someone's exceptional, or someone's good at wiping fingerprints." Drake said nothing. Back in the cabin, turbulence shook the plane gently. Nothing serious. But the seatbelt sign pinged. The flight attendants moved with calm. Shaq opened his eyes. The woman across from him gripped her armrest again. He reached into his backpack, pulled out the same hoodie, and offered it once more. She smiled, less nervous this time. Less surprised. "You're like an air angel," she joked softly. Shaq chuckled. "Nah, just tall and useful." The cabin lights flickered once. Power redirect from the weather pattern ahead. In the cockpit, Drake tapped the intercom button again. "We're expecting light shop for the next few minutes. Please stay seated. Shouldn't be too rough unless you've got a loose conscience." Darren's head turned. "Excuse me?" he asked, voice sharper now. Drake shrugged. "Joke. People need humor at 30,000 feet. Some jokes age badly." Drake didn't reply. Darren reached forward and tapped the cockpit recorder. A red light blinked on, and steady. "I like when things are clearly documented," he said. Drake's hands tightened on the controls. "What exactly are you looking for?" he asked. Darren leaned back. "Confirmation." "Of what?" "That clean records don't always mean clean men." For the first time, Drake's posture shifted. His calm cracked, not enough for panic, but enough for a crease of sweat to gather near his temple. The rest of the flight unfolded in calm skies. No major shakes. No announcements, just the quiet hum of truth, slowly coming to altitude. When the landing gear deployed and wheels touched down, the jolt wasn't hard, but it wasn't soft either. Just enough to remind everyone that gravity still worked, and that even long flights eventually face ground. As passengers stood and collected their things, Shaq remained seated. He looked down the aisle and saw Darren nodding to him. No words. No need. Drake stood in the cockpit doorway again, scanning the cabin, his expression unreadable. But this time, no one looked away. People watched him back. The winds had changed. Somewhere over Missouri, cruising at 35,000 feet, the clouds below looked like a sea of frozen waves. From the window of seat 1A, Shaq watched them roll like time itself. Silent, vast, indifferent to the weight of human things. The cabin lights were dimmed, voices low, a midday stillness, settling into the passengers like the calm after a long breath. A baby started crying 3 rows back. At first just a soft whimper, but then came the full sobs. Sharp and desperate. The mother, a young woman who looked like she'd had 4 hours of sleep in 4 days, was already scrambling. Bottle out, blanket dropped. Nerves unraveling with each shriek. Passengers shifted. Some irritated, others simply unsure what to do. The space that had felt peaceful now tensed with discomfort. Shaq unbuckled his belt without a word and stood. The flight attendant motioned as if to stop him. Turbulent protocol, but he raised one hand gently, reassuring. He walked down the aisle with the ease of someone who knew he was seen, but not there to be watched. His steps were steady. No rush, no panic. He crouched beside the woman's seat, his massive frame folding in a way that seemed to surprise everyone around him. "You're good," he said softly. "You're not bothering anyone." The mother's eyes welled up. "He won't stop crying. I tried feeding him. I think his ears are hurting." Shaq nodded. "He's just trying to figure it out. It's loud." His little world's shaking. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a keychain with a small rubber basketball attached. It squeaked faintly when squeezed. "My daughter used to chew on this when she was teething. Don't worry. It's clean." The baby reached out instantly, grabbed it, and stuffed it in his mouth. The crying slowed, then stopped. A ripple of breath moved through the cabin. Some passengers smiled. Others whispered. The tension dissolved like fog touched by sun. Shaq helped the mother pick up the blanket and bottle cap from the floor, then returned to his seat, nodding to the attendant as he passed. Back up front, the cockpit was quieter on the surface. Darren Holt sat in the co-pilot's seat, eyes calmly tracking the monitor. He hadn't spoken much in the past hour, choosing instead to observe. Every switch, every flick of Drake's fingers, every coded communication logged. Drake, for his part, had returned to autopilot, both literally and figuratively. His voice had cooled, no more snide remarks over the PA, no unnecessary banter. He was flying clean, too clean, the kind of clean that was almost performative. Darren leaned back in his seat. "Cabin's calm. Looks like smooth sailing from here." Drake snorted. "That's what they always say before it hits the fan." "You expecting something?" "Not me," Drake said, flicking the switch. "But passengers like the one in 1A? They bring storms with them. Attention follows them like rain." Darren raised an eyebrow. "You mean Shaq? I mean people who think altitude makes them untouchable." Darren paused. "He seems like the calmest person on this flight." Drake didn't look at him. They always do, until something doesn't go their way. There was silence for a beat. Then Drake muttered, just loud enough, thinking he'd covered the mic. "Some people get too used to being treated like kings. Forget they're just passengers like everyone else." Click. The red light on the cockpit recorder blinked once silently. Darren said nothing. He didn't need to. He checked his tablet subtly. The internal system showed an active log. Timestamped it. Audio secure. Drake kept flying, oblivious. Back in 1A, Shaq adjusted his seat. He hadn't heard the words clearly, not all of them, but he felt the weight of them pass through the metal walls, like heat, traveling through steel. He looked up, met Darren's gaze through the partially opened cockpit door. Darren nodded once. That was enough. The rest of the flight passed in deceptive peace. Drinks were served. A movie flickered across a shared screen. No one watched. The baby stayed asleep, clutching the squeaky basketball like a lifeline. But above all that, below the quiet, something was growing. A hum of exposure, a truth finally climbing to altitude. Darren waited until they hit descent protocol before saying another word to Drake. "You know, I've read a lot of reports," he said, conversational. Some clean. Some interesting. Drake adjusted the throttle, not looking over. Comes with the job. Yeah. But there's this one back in 2017. Latina flight attendant. Claimed harassment. Reassigned. No action taken. Drake didn't flinch. That case was settled. No misconduct proven. I didn't say your name was in it. Drake hesitated now, hands still. Darren turned slightly toward him. Thing is, pilots who leave trails eventually stop caring who sees them, because they think the cockpit protects them. You accusing me of something? Drake asked. No, Darren replied. I'm listening. And recording. Drake turned fully now, jaw clenched. You're not I yet. Darren tapped the badge under his jacket. Internal Affairs. Special Assignment. FAA Directive. Drake sat back, stunned. The instruments still blinked, but the air inside the cockpit was suddenly too dense to breathe. You set me up, he muttered. No, Darren said. You set yourself up. I'm just making sure the landing's documented. Back in the cabin, the seatbelt sign blinked on. Passengers sat up. Shaq, calm, buckled his belt. He felt it, that shift in air, the subtle way justice begins to stretch its wings. As the wheels touched down, the cabin jolted lightly, but everyone remained composed. When the brakes hissed and the aircraft slowed, people began murmuring again, about the school visit, about the baby, about kindness that felt rare at 30,000 feet. The intercom clicked. Drake's voice returned, strained but composed. Welcome to Denver International, folks. Local time is 3:48 p.m. We thank you for flying with us. But this time, no one clapped. As the plane taxied to the gate, Darren unbuckled early, protocol for internal agents on surveillance flights. He stepped out of the cockpit and made his way toward Shaq. They met in the aisle, just before the first-class curtain. Darren extended his hand. We got him. Shaq looked at the hand, then shook it. No one ever really gets got, he said. But truth? It sticks longer than lies. Darren nodded. The recording's clean, full. FAA will open a formal review by morning. I'll be submitting Geneva Wallace's file too. Shaq's eyes flickered. She deserves her wings back. We'll do what we can. You just gave her the momentum she needed. Passengers began standing, grabbing bags, stretching limbs. Shaq stayed where he was. As Drake emerged from the cockpit, his eyes darted to Darren, then to Shaq. There was no smirk now. Just a man beginning to see the edge of the platform he'd been standing on. Shaq didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Drake walked past, shoulders no longer square, the uniform still intact, but the authority behind it starting to crack. The intercom clicked again, this time by accident. The cabin heard Drake's voice faintly. Just get me off this flight. And just like that, it echoed. Because some things, what's said in the clouds, in steel cages wrapped in silence, don't stay up there forever. They land. He hadn't forgotten it. He'd just delayed it. Not out of fear, but instinct. The timing never felt right. And yet now, after everything, the school visit, Geneva's USB, the recordings at 30,000 feet, and the look in Drake's eyes as he stepped off that plane. Now the silence around that letter felt heavier than before, like something had been waiting to speak through it. Shaq sat at the edge of the bed, the envelope in one hand, fingers running along its sealed edge. The handwriting was clean, deliberate. No company logo, just his name, no one else's. He tore it open carefully. Inside was a single page, typewritten, signed in ink. Mr. O'Neill. I know this isn't the most conventional way to reach out, but conventional has never cracked the kinds of stories I chase. My name is Cliff Rowan. I'm an independent investigative journalist. For the last 5 years, I've been quietly collecting cases, testimonies, and suppressed reports tied to systemic racial and gender bias in U.S. commercial aviation. What began with a routine discrimination suit spiraled into something larger, darker, and harder to prove. You were on my radar long before this flight. I've studied your philanthropy, your low-profile impact. You help quietly, which makes your influence harder to detect and harder to spin. I respect that. When I saw your name on the boarding manifest of Flight 2038, on a plane captained by Warren Drake, I made a bet with myself. He wouldn't last a full itinerary without slipping. Because men like him never do. And when they fall, it's not a crash. It's a pattern unraveling.
I believe you hold the last piece of the puzzle.
The moment he forgets the mic is on, the moment he says the thing he's always felt entitled to say, that's what I'm waiting on. That's what I think you're going to deliver. Not for me, but for everyone who's been grounded by people like him. If this letter finds you after that moment, call me. We're almost there. Cliff Rowan. Cell number handwritten below. Shaq stared at the letter for a moment, after reading, not because of surprise, but because of the precision. Rowan had written this before the flight, before the turbulence, before the smirk, before the laugh, and yet somehow he already knew how it would go. Shaq leaned back against the headboard, phone in hand, letter still open on the bed. He dialed the number. It rang once.
Then picked up.
Cliff Rowan, said a voice. Calm. Direct. This is Shaquille. Shaq replied. No preamble. No explanation. There was a pause, not of disbelief, but of something quieter. Like recognition meeting confirmation. I was expecting your call, Cliff said. Shaq glanced toward the window. You were watching the flight manifest. I was watching what happens when arrogance gets cornered by integrity, Cliff replied. I take it he cracked. Hot mic, full audio, internal affairs was on board. Cliff exhaled. Then we've got it. Geneva Wallace gave me more, Shaq added. Emails, audio from 2017. The same playbook, just different names. I know her case, Cliff said, voice sharper now. They buried it with bureaucracy, called her a liability. She flew cleaner than most men in that seat. She still will, Cliff replied. If we do this right. Shaq stood and began pacing slowly, one hand on his hip, the other gripping the phone tighter. You wrote this letter before the flight, he said. How'd you know he'd snap? Cliff didn't hesitate. Because Warren Drake is a man who's been told too long that the air above others' heads belongs to him. And you? You don't ask for space, you walk in and fill it. That scares men like him more than any speech. Your calm is confrontation to someone who needs chaos to stay in control. Shaq stopped pacing. What happens next? I release it all, Cliff said. Not as a takedown, not as a hit piece, as a map, a trail of silenced voices, now connected. I've got interviews from former crew, quiet settlements, one woman from Raleigh, who was grounded after refusing Drake's dinner invite, another from Phoenix, whose incident report was reworded before it reached FAA. You waited for a name like mine to break it open, Shaq said. Not accusing, just understanding. Cliff didn't dodge. Yes, because your name shifts the burden of proof. People listen differently when the person being dismissed isn't just familiar but admired. It's not fair, but it's real. Shaq let that sit. You're not just a witness, Cliff continued. You're a catalyst. You were always going to be. Even if you hadn't opened that envelope. Shaq moved to the window, looked out at the parking lot below. Cars still, people unaware that something invisible was about to change overhead. I don't want to be the headline, he said. You won't be, Cliff assured him. The system will be. There was silence. Then a softer tone from Cliff. I know you didn't sign up for this. Shaq's voice was quiet. I never do. But the story keeps coming. Cliff paused. Are you ready for the blowback? Shaq finally smiled. A tired smile. But real. I've been big all my life. People throw their shade. I just block it different now. Cliff chuckled. Then we're greenlit. Send it, Shaq said. All of it. I already have a press release queued. But this? This won't be just media. This'll go to policymakers, unions, pilots who've been watching but afraid to speak. This isn't just about firing a man. It's about ending the pattern. Shaq nodded slowly, even though no one could see him. Send me what you're publishing. I'll add a line.
What kind of line?
Shaq looked down at the letter again. Ran his thumb along the edge of the page. Something simple. There's enough sky for all of us. But the wrong hands can make it feel like a ceiling. Cliff didn't respond right away. Then, that's a headline I'd actually read. They ended the call. Shaq stood in the quiet for a long time. He picked up the envelope, now empty, folded it once, slipped it into his bag, next to Geneva's USB, and the flight safety card he'd kept from, not souvenirs, receipts. He looked toward the door, not with urgency, but purpose. Outside, the sky stretched clear again, wide and blue, no turbulence in sight. But this time, what flew into it wouldn't be hidden in silence. This time, the echoes would carry. The press conference was held in a bland conference hall at Denver International. Gray carpeting, bottled water on every table, and a stale buzz of anticipation thick in the air. Fold-out chairs filled with reporters, bloggers, airline reps, and aviation officials, all lined up like they were waiting for a verdict. The airline's logo sat awkwardly behind the podium, backlit too brightly, like it was trying to shine through the shame.
This wasn't a routine media update, everyone in the room knew it. It wasn't about flight schedules or mechanical improvements. It was about Flight 2038, about what had been said in the sky, about the moment the pilot forgot his mic was live, and the world heard the quiet rot hiding behind a professional uniform.
Warren Drake sat 2 chairs away from the podium, stiff in a suit, not his captain's stripes. His jaw was clenched, knuckles pale where they gripped the armrests of his chair. He hadn't shaved that morning. He looked smaller now, still tall, still sharp-jawed, but shrunk by the weight of exposure. Next to him sat 2 lawyers and an airline executive, who kept checking their phone like there was still time to dodge the incoming wave. Shaq stood off to the side, not behind a curtain, not backstage, just out of view. Arms folded, face unreadable. He wasn't dressed for headlines. Simple shirt, slacks, sneakers. He hadn't come to take a spotlight. He'd come to make sure the truth didn't get rewritten under polished statements and neutral language. The airline spokesperson stepped up first, clearing her throat into the mic, her voice rehearsed and smooth. "We want to begin by thanking you all for coming on short notice. As many of you are aware, certain comments were captured during Flight 238 that do not reflect our company's values or commitment to inclusion. After reviewing the incident in coordination with FAA officials and internal affairs, we are taking this matter seriously and conducting a full procedural review of cockpit conduct protocols." The room remained still. Pens scratched across notepads. Cameras flashed. "We also want to acknowledge Mr. Shaquille O'Neal," she continued, glancing toward where he stood, "for his grace and patience during a situation that never should have occurred." Shaq didn't move. Then she stepped aside, and Captain Warren Drake walked toward the podium. The air shifted. He stood there for a beat, looking over the room with a face that tried to perform regret but couldn't quite let go of pride. He unfolded a small piece of paper from his jacket. His voice, when it came, was dry. "Practice. I'd like to begin by saying that I regret any misunderstanding or offense caused by my words during Flight 238. My comments were not intended to reflect any prejudice or disrespect. It was an unguarded moment, and I recognize how that moment may have been perceived. There it was, the dodge. Perceived, may have caused. Not I did. Just, if you felt hurt, that's on you," he continued, glancing down occasionally. "I respect Mr. O'Neal and all passengers I've served in my 20 years of flight. I have always strived to maintain professionalism, and while I acknowledge this instance may not have met that standard, I hope to grow and learn from this." When he finished, he folded the paper again, looked out across the room, and then turned toward Shaq. He extended a hand. The flashbulbs popped in a frenzy. Reporters leaned forward like this was the climax they'd been waiting for. But Shaq didn't move. He looked at the hand, then up at Drake's face. He held that stare for 3 long seconds, then stepped past it. Not around. Through. He walked straight to the podium, leaving the offered hand hanging in the air. The silence that followed wasn't dramatic. It was dense, a stillness you could feel in your bones. Shaq adjusted the mic. He didn't have notes. Didn't need them. "I'm not here to clap for an apology," he said, voice low, steady. Every syllable carried like it had been waiting years to breathe. "I've heard a lot of words like that, from a lot of men in suits. If I offended someone, if it was taken out of context, that kind of language isn't apology. That's insulation." He paused. "I didn't come here to cancel anyone. I came here to ask something simple. Who gets to be comfortable in the air? Who gets to board without feeling judged before they buckle a seatbelt?" He looked at Drake now, not with venom, with precision. "People think dignity is something we earn through titles. Captain, officer, CEO. But dignity isn't awarded by rank. It's practiced in how we treat the people we think we're above." The crowd was locked in. No shuffling. No whispering. Just breath held in real time. "I don't need a handshake," Shaq continued. "I don't need a quote for your headlines. I don't even need an apology that tries to hit all the PR-approved beats. What I need is action." He turned slightly, addressing the airline reps now. "What I need is for flight crews to know their complaints won't be buried in folders marked sensitive. What I need is for captains to stop thinking silence means support. What I need is for the little boy in seat 24B, who watched the news last night, to know that flying doesn't belong to a few. It belongs to all of us." He took a breath. Not for effect, for control. Forgiveness isn't earned in words, it's lived in action, and we all gotta start somewhere. Then he stepped back, not a drop of anger in his voice. Just grace. The kind that doesn't make noise but leaves marks. Reporters didn't shout questions. For once they just sat with it. One woman in the front row lowered her pen and stared at her recorder like it had somehow failed to capture what it just witnessed. Drake still stood near the podium. His hand was now tucked into his jacket pocket, his face unreadable. The press conference ended 10 minutes later. The room cleared slowly. No one seemed in a rush. Shaq stepped outside into the sunlight, unbothered by the cluster of cameras waiting by the curb. He waved a single nod to the crowd, then kept walking. As he reached the end of the building, a man in a denim jacket approached quietly. "No mic, no notebook. I work ramp," he said. "Been on the tarmac for 12 years. I saw what you did in there." Shaq looked him in the eye. "Appreciate you." The man shook his head. "No, thank you. I've seen what happens to the ones who speak up. You spoke for all of us." Shaq nodded again. No grand gesture, just connection. Behind him, the airport hummed back to life. Flights resumed, screens updated. But for the first time in a long while, something different rode in the air above the runways. Not just accountability, possibility. The ride home from Denver was quiet. No cameras, no headlines, no retweets chasing his every move. Just Shaq in the back of a black SUV, watching the city fade into trees, then roads, then familiar blocks that hadn't changed in years. His phone buzzed, now and then. Calls from people he respected, messages from people who'd once stayed silent, now stepping up with thanks and truth. But he let most of them sit. Some things didn't need immediate answers. He rolled the window down halfway as they turned the final corner toward his neighborhood. The air smelled like cut grass, and the hint of a grill 2 houses down. Home. Not the kind made of walls, but the kind built from knowing you belong without earning it every day. The driver pulled into the long driveway. Shaq stepped out slowly, stretching his legs, feeling the tension of the last 48 hours begin to unravel in his joints. He didn't head for the door right away. He stood for a moment staring at the porch steps, then up at the sky, clear again, soft blue, no turbulence in sight. The front door opened before he knocked. Raina ran out barefoot, hair tied in a loose bun, a college hoodie 2 sizes too big hanging off one shoulder. She didn't say anything at first, just wrapped her arms around him like she needed to remind herself he was real. He bent slightly to meet her hug, arms enveloping her like she was still 10 years old, and asking him why planes didn't fall from the sky. "You okay?" she asked into his chest. He nodded. "I'm good." She leaned back to look at him, eyebrows furrowed. "You don't look like someone who just helped change policy." Shaq smirked. "I don't look like anything I've done. That's by design." She shook her head with a smile and pulled him inside. The house smelled like cinnamon and something baking in the oven. Lucille had clearly been by. Photos lined the hallway walls, but Shaq noticed a new one had been added. A printout of that photo from the school. Him kneeling beside the kid reciting the poem. The moment had gone viral. Raina had printed it herself. He set his bag down, glanced at it. "You ever slow down?" she asked, falling onto the living room couch. "I try," he said, following her in. "But the world don't really let you." She folded her legs under her. "So, what now? You gonna fly private forever?" Shaq chuckled. "I'm not hiding, I'm just taking the window seat a little more seriously." She paused. "You never fight fire with fire, do you?" He looked at her for a long second. "You fly above it." That made her smile, but it also made her quiet. The kind of quiet that meant something bigger was settling in. "I was proud of you," she said softly. "Not because you exposed him, because you stayed steady. You didn't humiliate him. You didn't return what he gave." "I don't fly to bring people down," he said. "I fly to remind people how high we're meant to go." She nodded, then stood up. "There's banana bread in the kitchen. Grandma's way of saying she missed you." He grinned. "Then I better go eat before she accuses me of being too famous for homemade bread." She disappeared down the hallway, and Shaq moved slowly through the living room, stopping near the window. He looked outside, where the sun had started to dip, painting the sky with long streaks of orange and pink. He opened the door and stepped onto the porch, the wood warm under his feet. The breeze carried the sound of sprinklers from a neighbor's lawn, and the faint, distant bass of someone's evening playlist. A kid rode by on a rusted bike, one pedal sticking, his backpack bouncing behind him. He looked over, slowed down when he recognized the man standing there. "You're the reason I believe I belong anywhere," the boy shouted without stopping. Shaq blinked. Just once, then smiled. "Keep pedaling," he called back. "You already do." The boy raised a fist into the air like a victory sign, and turned the corner. Shaq leaned against the porch column, arms folded. Not because he was tired, but because he knew what that boy meant. He knew what it was to walk into rooms, board planes, enter spaces with invisible rules about who should be there, and who should. But now, those spaces would feel a little different. Not because of a takedown, but because of a shift. A reminder. A weight move. He looked up at the sky one more time. It looked the same. Still blue. Still open. Still bigger than any man who ever tried to limit who could reach it. His voice, quiet now, like a thought made audible, closed the moment. "The sky don't care about color. But some folks do. My job ain't to change 'em, just to keep flying till they learn. If this story made you pause, don't just walk away, walk forward. Carry it into your next conversation, your next boardroom, your next flight. Not everyone gets turbulence you can see, but we all feel when the air's not right. Change doesn't start at 30,000 feet. It starts where you're standing. Keep your seatbelt fastened, truth still climbing."